The United States entered the Vietnam War in earnest in 1964 after a controversial incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. The incident was an attack on an American destroyer, the Maddox, by North Vietnamese PT boats. The outrage and the alleged attack 2 days later on the Turner Joy provoked the U.S. Congress to give President Johnson a free hand in running the war. What no one in the administration explained to Congress was that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was not an unprovoked act. In fact, the American ship was placed off the coast of North Vietnam specifically to be attacked. Once in place, the ship simulated the radio traffic that would take place, leading up to an air assault against North Vietnamese ports. The not unforeseeable counterattack became Lyndon Johnson's cover story. Without it, he would have had to pay a too heavy political price for his buildup in Vietnam. The Johnson administration was made up of advisors collectively known as the Whiz Kids, holdovers from the Kennedy White House. They were statisticians and efficiency experts, confident that if the United States could just maintain a certain pace in the war, the enemy would eventually concede defeat. These guys were number crunchers, and they worked for a president who revered politics above everything. As Congress and the public grew concerned about American involvement in Vietnam, Johnson promised to limit American involvement in the war. In reality, he had no intention of doing that, and buried the truth in a flurry of statistics. That numbers game was to have a tragic effect on the air war in Vietnam. Johnson did cut the number of American aircraft in Vietnam, but he did it by deploying aircraft to bases off Vietnamese soil in Thailand or Guam, within range of Vietnam. That meant flight crews arriving over drop sites were exhausted from long flights, and that the enemy force they were sent to intercept had long since moved on through the jungle. Militarily, stationing aircraft so far from the battlefield was a bad decision. Numerically, however, it made perfect sense. What was important to the whiz kids back in Washington wasn't the real military effect of the mission. What they cared about was the number of planes on the ground and the tonnage of bombs dropped from the sky. In effect, the numbers became the reality. Unlike World War II, where the enemy's strength was concentrated in the major cities and in vast industrial complexes, in Vietnam, the communist strength was concentrated in the rural areas. It was there that the anti-Saigon government feeling ran the deepest, but the countryside was also where the American strategy of bombing the Vietnamese into submission had the least effect. In Vietnam, with an economy based on subsistence farming and a decentralized enemy, it would be hard to imagine a less effective weapon than massive air power. General Curtis LeMay had promised to bomb the North into the Stone Age, but that boast was lost on a foe whose society had barely progressed beyond the Stone Age. The air war in Nam was called Rolling Thunder. It was a two-tiered approach to air war. Closest to the fighting on the ground were the smaller aircraft, the F-1s, O-5s, and the 104s. They worked down low and fast, doing the job that in earlier wars would have been done by artillery. When troops on the ground engaged the enemy, they called in an air response and got the hell out of the area. The fast movers would then come in, hauling napalm, and burn everything within a mile of the drop coordinates, including the enemy. The second tier was the B-52s, flying in from Guam in Thailand, each dropping 30 tons of bombs. One B-52 flying alone could wipe out an area the size of 10 football fields, and the U.S. Air Force sent waves. The air war changed forever when the North Vietnamese started taking delivery of Russian surface-to-air missiles. The SAMs were installed to protect North Vietnamese cities from American bombers, making Hanoi, the North Vietnamese capital, the most heavily defended city in the world. As the Soviets moved anti-aircraft missiles into the north, Washington sent word to the air crews that the launch sites were not to be bombed while under construction because the Russian technicians were building the batteries. The White House feared the repercussions should Soviet technicians be killed. For months, American aircraft would fly over undefended SAM sites, watching the construction, and then be ordered back to attack those exact sites when the enemy was able to shoot back. The losses were staggering. To counter the SAMs, Air Force commanders came up with one of the most harebrained and successful tactics: the wild weasels. The wild weasels were pilots flying F-105s and later F-104s who would fly ahead of the main flight, painting himself on the enemy radar and hanging around in the kill zone of the SAMs long enough for the ground battery to take a shot at him. Once the Vietnamese lit up their radar, the sites were easy to find and destroy. It did not take long for the North Vietnamese to recognize the tactic, but it still left them with no good way to respond. The weasels would strike hard and fast to remove the fangs from the enemy's air defense. As the size and effectiveness of the CIDG continued to grow, the Joint Chiefs began to doubt that the CIA had the personnel and resources to manage all the Special Forces troops now in the country. As the Special Forces operations continued to win hearts and minds, Washington made a fatal decision. They switched tactical command of Green Beret operations from the CIA to MAC-V. Once MAC-V had command of the CIDG program, the mission began to change. For both the SF troops and the local strike force, the change was for the worse. MAC-V understood neither the nature of special operations nor the requirements of counterinsurgency. From the beginning, MAC-V viewed the Berets' involvement in the CIDG program as too static. As a result, the Green Berets were removed from the role of administering the CIDG program and reassigned to providing surveillance along the Cambodian and Laotian borders. Now, the Shadow Warriors would conduct offensive missions against the belly of the beast, Viet Cong support bases. By 1965, U.S. ground forces were pouring into Vietnam, and the newly established 5th Special Forces Group was actively taking action against Viet Cong infiltration routes. The standing order was to find, fix, and destroy the enemy forces where they live. The team was flown in by unmarked Hueys that would touch down on a number of clearings before the A-team would jump out and head for cover on the run. Life had become more dangerous for the Warriors as they took on a mission they knew they were not designed to handle. The A-teams, small in size and equipped for rapid movement, did not carry enough firepower to fight running battles with trained and heavily armed NVA and trail guard regiments. By 1965, in spite of the best efforts of the SFA teams and the strike forces, the situation in Vietnam worsened. By the end of January, the Viet Cong were conducting large-scale operations, less than 50 miles from Saigon. To counter that threat, U.S. forces were about to meet the enemy face-to-face in strength for the first time. In the early years of the U.S. military's involvement in Vietnam, before American troops were fully committed to the fight against the falling dominoes of communism in Southeast Asia, the Army's top brass were haunted by what had happened to the last great colonial power there. long before they were overwhelmed and forced to surrender at Dien Bien Phu. The French army had been outmaneuvered and outfought by General Vo Nguyen Giap's Viet Minh. Hiding in the jungles and staying on the move, the Viet Minh harassed and decimated the larger, slower, less mobile French forces. They had an almost supernatural ability to appear out of nowhere, strike quickly and hard, and disappear into the countryside again. The American war planners knew that, like the French, they would find their superior technology and strength reduced, if not canceled out altogether, by the thick jungle, with only a few narrow, twisting roads. The unlikely answer came from the Army's experience in Korea. There, the helicopter had proven a quick and reliable way to transport wounded out of combat areas. Its speed and maneuverability suggested a new kind of use for a new kind of war. In 1962, the Army began training its 11th Air Assault Test Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, the same proving ground where it had developed its airborne infantry capability for World War II. For more than 2 years, the new cavalry practiced its art. The quick insertion of assault forces, weapons, and equipment at predetermined landing zones, or LZs, coordinated with artillery and tactical air support in precisely timed movements. In the summer of 1965, the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Air Mobile was deployed to Vietnam. Their first base camp was at An Key in Central Highlands, in the II Corps' command zone. They would not have long to wait for the first test of the Air Mobile doctrine. In October 1965, a regiment of the People's Army of North Vietnam, operating in the jungle-covered mountains of Pleiku Province near Vietnam's border with Cambodia, attacked the U.S. Special Forces camp at Plei My, not far from An Key. Seemingly out of nowhere, in a surprise action reminiscent of the NVA's successful campaign against the French, the enemy emerged from the jungle en masse and laid siege to Plei My. When a nearby unit of South Vietnamese regulars moved in to help the Americans, the NVA ambushed them. It was time for the U.S. cavalry to ride to the rescue. It was time for Air Mobile. The air cav swept into the area where the South Vietnamese units were under attack, using large CH-46 and 47 helicopters to deploy 105mm howitzers to landing zones within range of the communist positions. From there, the howitzers pounded the communist forces, allowing the South Vietnamese to escape and continue on to Plei My. At the same time, the air cav was moving its artillery into place near Plei My. Hours of heavy and deadly accurate shelling forced the Vietnamese regiment to give up the siege and retreat westward, back toward the Cambodian jungle. The U.S. command immediately ordered Major General Harry W.O. Kennard, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, to pursue and destroy the enemy. The Army had intelligence reports that at least one full regiment of communist troops, and possibly two, was deployed in the Central Highlands and preparing a major offensive there. Kennard sent the 1st Brigade, 7th Cavalry, into the wilderness west of Plei My in pursuit of the retreating North Vietnamese. Unable to see their enemy through the thick canopy of the rainforest, the 1st of the 7th moved west toward the Ai Drang River Valley and the forbidding Chu Pong Massif. As they went, they employed a technique called reconnaissance by fire. Cruising above the treetops, out of the range of small arms fire, helicopter gunships fired into the dense growth, flushing and then reducing enemy units more or less at random as they waited for the chance to deliver the killing blow. But this was Vietnam, and the enemy was not about to be so easily eliminated, and had plans to deliver a killing blow of its own. In October 1965, elements of the U.S. Army's 1st Air Cavalry had repulsed a massive attack by North Vietnamese Army regulars on the American Special Forces camp at Plei My in the central highlands of Vietnam. Now, in mid-November, under orders from the Air Cav commander, Major General Harry Kennard, the 3rd Brigade of the 7th Cavalry, the storied Gary Owen Brigade, had taken up the Air Cav's search and destroy mission to find and finish off what remained of the NVA forces that had attacked Plei My. Colonel Thomas W. Brown, commander of the Gary Owen Brigade, assigned Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore and his 450-man 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry to make an air mobile insertion into the valley of the Ai Drang River. The location was about 20 miles west of Plei My, at the foot of the Chu Pong Mountains, and General Kennard and Colonel Brown thought it was the most likely place to find the communist regulars. On November 14, 1965, after making 2 reconnaissance overflights of the target area and identifying several possible landing zones, LZs, Moore selected LZ X-Ray, a wide, irregularly shaped clearing between 2 dry ravines, overgrown with elephant grass. Just after 10 in the morning, Moore's supporting artillery laid down a heavy barrage in the area of the LZ X-Ray. At 10:48 a.m., Moore's were the first boots on the ground as the 16 Air Cav Hueys delivered 2 platoons of his B Company to the landing zone. As Moore set up his command post, 2 platoons moved into position at the perimeter of the LZ on what would become the assault force's right flank. Half an hour later, choppers brought in a 3rd platoon of B Company and one of A Company. The B platoon immediately moved out to the perimeter, taking up a reconnaissance position to the left of the first 2 platoons. The A Company platoon set up in the center of the LZ to act as security for the landings. "50 minutes later, as 2 more platoons from A Company were shuttled in, the 2 forward platoons of B Company, doing reconnaissance on the right flank of the LZ, encountered elements of the NVA's 7th Battalion 66th Regiments, and the firefight began. Without knowing it, Moore and his men had landed at the doorstep of 2 full communist infantry regiments, the 66th and the 69th. The enemy, through massive reinforcements through the jungle to the other side of the LZ, attempted to flank the badly outnumbered Americans. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the 3 platoons of B Company were battling for their lives in an intense and confusing firefight on the right flank. Moore ordered his reserves into the fight as a flight of choppers brought in 3 platoons from C Company to stop the flanking maneuver and shore up the American left. With fresh troopers on the ground, Moore ordered his units to form 2 cohesive lines along the west and south of the LZ and move into the tree line to extend the perimeter and secure the landing zone for future airlifts. As the firefight escalated, Moore learned that 3rd Platoon, B Company, had pushed too far out into the jungle on the right flank and had been cut off from the rest of the American forces. Surrounded and taking fire from 3 sides, the 29-man unit was holding on for dear life against more than 200 North Vietnamese. As the afternoon wore on, the NVA escalated their attack on the American positions, determined to overrun them and wipe them out. Moore called in heavy air support from B-52 bombers operating in the 2-corps zone to plaster the jungle around his position as the Air Cav's artillery support units continued to pour in fire from nearby landing zone Falcon. But the air and artillery support were not as effective as they might have been. The NVA had learned in their war against the French that if they fought in close proximity to their enemy, a strategy they called clinging to the belt, the enemy could not use its air cover and artillery to full effect without killing great numbers of its own men. The Huey pilots braved withering ground fire to make 3 more lifts, bringing in additional rifle platoons from companies C and D, heavy weapons, and LRP units. At around 5 in the afternoon, the enemies rushed the center of the Cavs line, nearly breaking through, but were driven back by a fresh platoon from Company D. Time and time again, they pressed the outnumbered American troops. As night fell on the Ai Drang Valley, both sides pulled back and prepared to pass an uneasy night. Neither knew what the dawn would bring. At dawn on November 15, 1965, 13 platoons from rifle companies A, B, C, and D of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, U.S. 7th Cavalry, part of the Army's new 1st Cavalry Air Mobile, waited anxiously for the rising of the sun. They were dug in along the western and southern perimeters of a jungle clearing in the valley of the Ai Drang River in the Vietnamese Central Highlands province of Pleiku. In the dark jungle that lay between them and the 2,300-foot Chu Pong Massif, which separated Vietnam from Cambodia, 2 full infantry regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam were hunkered down and preparing to attack. The Americans knew the attack would come. They knew also that the enemy outnumbered them, perhaps by as much as 5 to 1. The 2 sides had exchanged heavy fire at close range for almost 11 hours on the previous day. Thousands of communist regulars lay dead, but they had kept coming with increasing savagery. At 6:30 in the morning, the communists launched another savage attack. A combined force of the 7th Battalion, 66th Regiment, and the main force Viet Cong launched a massive assault against the American left flank. Their attack was fast, deadly, and overwhelming. In less than 30 minutes, many of the American units were scattered. The fighting in the center of the line was hand to hand. At 700 hours, Moore instructed his radio men to send an urgent message to all American units operating in the zone. Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow means an American unit is under siege and in grave danger of being overrun. Within minutes, every American plane and artillery unit within range of the call answered, raining death on the horrified NVA in a spectacular display of firepower. At a little after 9 o'clock, the communists had been driven back, and LZ X-Ray was re-secured. Huey's brought in fresh troops from the 7th Cavalry 2nd Battalion to shore up the badly sagging American lines. Throughout the afternoon, 2nd Platoon B Company was cut off from the main force and taking fire from all sides. Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, with dusk approaching, Moore ordered companies A and B to move against the NVA on the right flank to try and rescue the lost platoon. After advancing only 100 meters against heavy resistance, Moore called for white phosphorus artillery to be dropped in the area between the communists and the lost platoon. While the phosphorus burned, the enemy took cover, breaking the rain of fire long enough for A Company to reach and bring back the battered platoon along with its dead and wounded. An hour later, the communist commander pulled his troops back from the LZ X-Ray to regroup in the jungle. At noon, Hueys and larger CH-46 and CH-47s began bringing in replacements for the hardest hit units. The battle was over. Landing Zone X-Ray was secured for the night. The Battle of Ai Drang was the first full-scale military engagement between the American and North Vietnamese armies. Lieutenant Colonel Moore and his men accomplished their objectives. They found and reduced the enemy force that had attacked the Special Forces camp at Plei Mi and drove it from the Pleiku province, killing more than 1,200 communist troops in the process. At Ai Drang, the Gary Owen Brigade proved that the Air Cav would be an effective and resilient fighting force, well suited for this new kind of warfare. But the cost was high. In just 2 days of battle, the Gary Owen Brigade lost almost 300 men. It was one of America's greatest battles,